So in our last section, we talked about how to use the regular colored pencils for coloring sheets, and right now I wanted to show you how to use watercolor paper and watercolor pencils to get a watercolor effect with the everything patterns. It's not intimidating, so don't be afraid. I'm going to walk you through every step. It's really easy and a lot of fun. Let's get started. Okay, now we're going to talk about watercolor pencils. And I have used watercolor paper. There's lots of different brands of watercolor papers, very expensive to very inexpensive. This is inexpensive watercolor paper that I bought at my local craft store. And so this is very easy to find. You don't have to spend a lot of money on watercolor paper. And what I've done is I've traced my design onto my watercolor paper using my light box. That was in a previous video, how to use the light box. So if you didn't see that, you can go back and check that out. And watercolor paper usually has like a bumpy surface to it that allows the paints to sit on it nicely and not to make the paper warp and bump a lot. So you're going to want to use the bumpy side of the paper. There's the smooth side. The bumpy side is actually the right side of the paper when you're talking about watercolor paper. And when I've traced my pattern, you can use a heavy or a fine point permanent marker. I've actually used both. I used they're both fine point, but the heavier one I've used for the major outlines, and then I did the details with the finer one. You can use just one or the other. It's fine. It's whatever your preference is, whatever look you want. Let's see, watercolor pencils, again, lots of different brands, lots of different price points. Choose whatever you can afford. And what's really cool about these is this is actually watercolor paint in a pencil. It's dry paint. So we're going to color the surface of our paper with it, and then when you add water, it will dissolve the paint and give you a watercolor effect. It's really neat and it's really fun. Okay, brushes. I've got a few different sizes here. For larger areas you'll want a bigger one, and then for smaller areas you'll want a smaller brush to get into those little details. And you'll need some water, and I always have some paper towels handy to blot my my brushes with. Another thing that you might want to have handy is a hairdryer. If you're somebody who's impatient and you don't want to have to wait for your paper to dry, you can use a hairdryer. I do that quite a bit. Okay, so we're going to color just like we did in the previous section with our colored pencils. I'm going to take a brown pencil and I'll do the leaf. And for the watercolor pencils, what you really want to do is concentrate your color on the edge. You don't want to color an entire section with the pencil, because what will happen is when you add the water, you'll just you can have too much color there. You can always go back and add color too. So what I'm going to do is just do the edges. And what else is really cool about watercolor pencils is it makes it really easy to blend your colors. So I've got that brown there. And if I want to, I can get a lighter brown, and I can come in and I can do some areas with a lighter brown and kind of get some variations in the color. I could even add a little bit of this orange if I wanted. Okay, and now we're going to add the water. So I'm just going to get a little water in my brush, and I'm going to start at the edge, and I'm going to start working in towards the center. And you can see how that pencil is dissolving into watercolor. Isn't that fun? Okay. So I'm just going to keep starting at the edge and working towards the center. I can get a little more water if I need it. See how I'm getting these nice variations in the color too, because I used a couple different colors of pencil. So this is really fun to experiment with. Again, the watercolor paper, you can get it pretty inexpensively at the craft store. And you know, if you do something you don't like, just start over. Have a lot of fun just experimenting with your colors. Okay? So you can see how that is done. And you would just keep going. Now, something to remember is once your paper is wet It's very soft, and remember, water will dissolve the paint in your pencil. So what you don't want to do at this point, now that the paper is wet, is say, oh, I wish that was darker, and go in with your pencil, because I'll show you what will happen if you try to do that. Let's say I wanted to darken that up. It's going to just lay down too much color. You can get blobs of color where it just kind of sinks down into the paper. You can't get it out. So what you want to do, if you want to add more color, is just wait for it to dry. See how I can't get those pencil lines out? Because I did it on the wet paper. So that's where that hairdryer really comes in handy. If you were feeling impatient, you could just hit this with the hairdryer, dry the paper, and then you could work that section again. Another thing when we're talking about wet paper, watercolors will bleed into each other as long as they're wet. So while this is wet, I would not want to go and do this section right here that's adjacent to it. I have to wait for this to dry. Either just be patient, wait for it to dry, use the hairdryer. What I'm going to do is I'm going to move on to another area. I'm going to move on to the scarf while I'm waiting for that to dry. Okay, so now let's do our scarf, and I think I will do maybe a little green for that. So again, come in, color just the edges. And you can actually come in and do a couple of sections at a time. Just mess around with it and see which, what works best for you. So I'm just adding some water to the center. I want it to get it like a dimensional look. I kind of want my color concentrated on the edges. And again, what I would probably do is let this dry and then come back and add a little bit more green. Or what I could even do is next time, once this is dry, come in with a darker green and just add a little bit of detail down at the bottom and build up that green color. Okay, now I want to do purple too, but I don't want to do my purple now right next to that because it's wet. So if I wanted to, I could just come in and start doing my purple in another section. And just keep going. It's really fun. Okay, so I've worked on the scarf a little bit. I think I want to add a little more purple here. You can see it's darker here than here. So now I've dried it with my hairdryer. I can go in. I can add a little more color where I want more color. You notice I'm concentrating my color down towards the bottom and in the and around the edges. That gives a little more dimension. Remember we were talking about that light source before in the first section. Again, I'm kind of keeping that in mind. Not too much, not being real strict with it, but kind of remembering that I want the bottom side of everything to be a little bit darker than the rest. Now, what you can do if you find that you've added, say, too much color, let's say I'm coloring this and I feel like it's going to be too dark, you can do what's called lifting, where you dry your brush on the paper towel, and if you just set your brush there and where you want it to be a little bit lighter, you can see it will pick up the color. That's a great way to make highlights. You have to do that while the paint is still wet, because what you're doing is letting the brush absorb the water into the bristles. It won't work if it's dry, if the paint's dry. So do that while it's wet. It's a nice way to give dimension to it, having that little highlight in the middle. So that is how you can do watercolor with the everything patterns. It's lots of fun. I really recommend that you give it a try. I think you'll really like it. This is something you could make doing the watercolor. I just did one of the designs from the Everything book on a piece of watercolor paper, and I used it to make a cover for an inexpensive legal pad that I got at the office supply store. You can get stacks and stacks of these legal pads or notebooks at the office supply store. Very inexpensive. I add a little bit of rickrack to the top and the bottom to just give it a little extra embellishment. These would make great gifts, and really you could just spend a whole afternoon or a weekend making a whole bunch of these, getting really creative. It's a lot of fun. So I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope you'll give it a try. Thanks.